Imagine standing on a cobblestone street in Boston in 1765 amidst an angry crowd. Shouts echoed, interspersed with church bells and the smell of smoke from bonfires lit in protest. An effigy of a British official hung from a tree while artisans, merchants, and farmers stomped their feet, chanting, "No taxation without representation." The atmosphere was boiling, while the pot about to overflow. The British colonies in North America, once proud subjects of the kingdom, now stood at a historical crossroads. This was a period when simmering discontent erupted into a blaze, as ideas of liberty and justice began to challenge the power of British Empire. The seed of revolution has been sown, and from the streets of Boston to the plantations of Virginia, the colonists were preparing for a struggle that would change the world. Background: Ancient Empire. After the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain achieved a glorious victory over France, expanding its control in North America. But this victory came at a high price. Britain's national debt soared, and Parliament in London decided that the colonies who had benefited from the war must share the financial burden. Imagine the merchants in Philadelphia just returned from the harbor, opening a letter from London and reading about new laws, import duties, taxes on goods, and stricter trade regulations. For the colonists, these measures were not just about money. They were an insult. They had never been consulted, never had representation in the British Parliament. The idea that they had to pay taxes without a voice was unacceptable. At the same time, the colonies were changing. The population boomed, with over 2 million people living along the East Coast, from bustling towns like Boston and New York to vast plantations in Virginia and Carolina. The settlers were no longer just British immigrants, they were American-born generations, proud of their land. Imagine a farming family in Massachusetts sitting around the dinner table, discussing news from the city. They read Benjamin Franklin newspapers, listened to sermons about liberty, and felt that they deserved a say in their own destiny. This spirit, nurtured by the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, now became the fire against distant British control. The Stamp Act, the first spark. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring all legal documents, licenses, and even newspapers in the colonies to bear a tax stamp. Imagine a lawyer in Boston opening a drawer and finding that every contract paper now had to have a stamp purchased from a British official. For the colonists, this was not just a tax, it was a symbol of oppression. They were accustomed to self-governance through colonial assemblies, where people like them elected representatives. But the Stamp Act, imposed from London, was a reminder that they were still subjects of a distant empire. The reaction was immediate and fierce. In Boston, a group called the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, a politician with sharp eyes and a fierce voice, organized protest. Imagine the scene: hundreds of people gathered in Liberty Square, burning effigies of tax collectors and destroying their offices. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry stood before the House of Burgesses, declaring that only the colonists had the right to tax themselves. His words, "Give me liberty or give me death," though not yet uttered at this time, had begun to echo in many minds. The colonies united in opposition. They organized a convention called the Stamp Act Congress, where representatives from 9 colonies met to draft a declaration asserting their rights. This was the first time the colonies acted as a unified bloc, a sign that they were not just separate communities but a nascent people. Merchants boycotted British goods, and women, called Daughters of Liberty, wove cloth at home to replace imports. Imagine a woman in Connecticut sitting at the loom, weaving and talking to their children about patriotism. These actions were not just economic, they were political statements. The Boston Massacre, Blood on the Snow. In 1766, under intense pressure, Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but soon after passed the Declaratory Act asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Tensions continued to escalate with new acts, such as the Taxation Acts of 1767, which taxed tea, glass, and other goods. The colonists responded with boycotts and protests. In Boston, the atmosphere became increasingly suffocating. British troops were sent to maintain order, and the presence of these redcoats on the streets became a source of discontent. Imagine a cold night in March 1770 on the streets of Boston. An angry crowd, from young men to dock workers, gathered before a group of British soldiers. They threw stones, snow, and insults. In the chaos, a panicked British soldier fired, and then the whole squad followed suit. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow, their blood staining the white ground. The Boston Massacre, as it was later called, became a flashpoint. Samuel Adams and his associates turned this event into a propaganda tool with engravings depicting brutal British soldiers firing on innocent civilians. Imagine a printer working through the night to print these posters, spreading the message of British injustice. The Boston Tea Party, a daring act of rebellion. Tensions peaked in 1773 with the Tea Acts. To save the British East India Company from bankruptcy, Parliament allowed them to sell tea directly at a low price, but still kept the tax. For the colonists, this was the last straw. They not only opposed the tax, but were also angry at being forced to buy tea from a monopoly company. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty decided to act. Imagine a December night in 1773 when men disguised as Mohawks, with blackened faces and feathers in their hair, quietly climbed aboard 3 ships in Boston Harbor. In the darkness, they opened the tea chest, smashed them, and threw more than 300 chests of tea into the sea. The harbor water shimmered with the smell of tea, and cheers erupted from the crowd on shore. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest, it was an open act of rebellion, directly challenging British authority. Britain responded with the coercive acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, restricting Massachusetts' self-governance, and forcing colonists to quarter British soldiers. Imagine a family in Boston having to open their home to soldiers they considered enemies. These acts, instead of quelling resistance, added fuel to the fire. Other colonies from Virginia to Rhode Island sent food and aid to Boston, showing an unprecedented spirit of unity. The Minds of Revolution. In the shadow of these events, thinkers began to lay the groundwork for a bold idea: independence. Imagine John Adams, a lawyer in Massachusetts, sitting in his small office, writing letters calling for colonial unity. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, a young man with a sharp pen, began to ponder the natural rights of man. Newspapers and pamphlets spread throughout the colonies with works like the Thomas Paine's Common Sense, to be published later in 1776, beginning to plant in people's minds the idea that they were not just British subjects, but a distinct people. Colonial assemblies began to meet more frequently, not just to protest, but also to prepare. In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress met in 1774, a gathering of representatives from 12 colonies. Imagine a room with solemn men in suits debating how to deal with Great Britain. They sent a petition to King George III demanding respect for their rights. but at the same time, they began to stockpiling weapons and training militias. In small towns, farmers practiced with rifles, ready to defend their communities. A nation awakening. By 1775, the colonies stood on the brink of revolution. The people, from tailors in Boston to plantation owners in Carolina, felt that they were no longer passive subjects. They were Americans, with a dream of society where they could determine their own destiny. But they also knew that the road ahead could be full of blood and fire. Imagine a blacksmith in Lexington sharpening his blade at night, or a mother in Philadelphia teaching her child about patriotism. These small actions, repeated throughout the colonies, were weaving a larger story, the story of a people ready to rise up. As dawn broke over the Massachusetts fields, church bells rang not only to call people to prayer, but also to warn of what's to come. The seeds of revolution had taken root, watered by discontent, nurtured by ideas of freedom, and ignited by the courage of ordinary people. Just a spark, a shot at Lexington or Concord, was enough to ignite the flame, opening a new chapter in the history not only of America, but the entire world.